Tonight we will be talking about time travel, travel to Mars, how he was involved in the programs. You guys can also watch one of Andrew's presentations. He has a series of presentations all over YouTube, hour-long ones, 6-hour-long ones. I recommend just watching the 6.5-hour-long presentation where he talks about time travel and Mars, and he's going to be running for president in 2016. That's what he claims. They'll probably commit voter fraud to keep him from getting in, like they did with Ron Paul, but it's totally worth the try, just like I'm actually running for United States, Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and I realize it'll take a miracle for me to win. I'm running as a third-party candidate. I'm making it totally grassroots, no money spent, no money asked for in donations, and I don't expect to win because it'll take a miracle, but it's worth it to get the info out. That's what's important in this day and age, getting the info out. And speaking of which, we will go to the news for the first 5 to 10 minutes of the show, courtesy of Alex Jones and Company at InfoWars. But before I do that, I need to take a moment to talk about a total police state experience I had, nanny state more specifically. Not I had, but someone else had, and I witnessed, because yesterday I went to the Harrisburg State Capitol building, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for a Second Amendment gun rally, because if we lose the Second Amendment, we lose everything. We need a right to bear arms to protect ourselves from tyrants and government. And after I got home from that rally, around 7 o'clock at night at the 30th Street SEPTA station in Philadelphia, went into the bathroom, was in a hurry to catch the train to my home in the suburbs. And as I was walking out the bathroom, I noticed about 6 cops had cornered a man, and so obviously an attempt to intimidate him. 6 transit police, actually, technically they were. And one of the officers said, "In all my years of being on the force of law enforcement, I have never seen a man stand 6 minutes in front of a urinal." Can you get any more pathetic? They confronted a man simply because he spent 6 minutes in front of a urinal. There's no crime there, folks. That's public property. It's a public commons run by the Department of Transportation, which is a government organization. Therefore, it's owned by the people who created the government. That man had every right to stand in front of the urinal for as long as he wants. He's not harming anyone, so it's not a crime. The only time it would have been a crime is if all the urinals and toilets were taken and he was deliberately holding up the line. They could certainly charge him with negligence there. But no, the bathroom was like half empty. I mean, the urinals, not even half empty, excuse me. There were only like 4 out of 20 urinals that were taken. And they hassled this guy for that. You got to be kidding me. And you can bet I'm going to call them and tell them just how pathetic they are, the transit police. But in addition to the news, there's a notice that popped here across the board of InfoWars. It's not one of the headlines down below, but it came across the screen. It said, Pennsylvania Supreme, this flies to me a lot, makes me really angry because I am a Pennsylvania resident. It said, Pennsylvania Supreme Court rules that police do not need warrant to search vehicles. A couple of important things here. The courts are probably going to say vehicles. Well, anybody who ever listened to Eddie Craig's masterpiece presentation, Secrets Police Don't Want You to Know, that's what it's called, Secrets Police Don't Want You to Know, on the Alex Jones channel. You can find it. It's about 2.5 hours long, totally worth your time. It proves that the only drivers who are required by law to obey transportation laws and also have licenses, insurance, registration, and license plates are commercial drivers. The laws of the road, transportation laws, don't apply to people who are just using their own personal cars, bikes, flying machines, and watercraft for non-commercial purposes. And the courts are probably going to, in the illusion, they use the word vehicle, and that is a commercial specific term, as are the words transportation, driving, operate, and passenger. And the fact that there's a legal definition that's commerce specific, which is different from the standard English dictionary definition, makes all the difference in the world here. And, well, the courts probably don't need warrants to search vehicles. So they're going to use that to search the cars of people who are using their cars and trucks and bikes for non-commercial purposes. And I can't help but wonder if they're responding to my crusade that I've been on for over a year, spreading Eddie Craig's Secrets Police Don't Want You to Know video like wildfire on a global scale using Facebook and other public resources. And I've gone crazy about that in Pennsylvania. Did they have me on my mind when they made this totally illegal ruling that they didn't have authority to make, that police can search cars without warrants, which they're under the illusion of being commercial specific, but they're going to actually do it to everybody? It's disgusting. And I don't know. I shouldn't be giving myself a lot of credit, but it is sick. But anyway, I'm going to do the rest of the news on the fly here. Democrat Senator Markey's hate speech bot designed to shut down speech and eliminate political oppression. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what this is about. Don't have time to look at it, but it is absolutely disgusting that they would shut down speech. unless it's hurtful speech. You don't have the right to use speech to harm other people's feelings, but speech other than that is perfectly legal. All right, here it is. Holder's latest scandal. Next headline, Eric Holder, the Attorney General's latest scandal. Department of Justice now pressuring banks to refuse service to gun stores. Operation Choke Point also targets other legal businesses for political reasons. The big mega banks, however, are probably going to be exempt to this. They're going to be able to serve the gun stores all they want because, harass the gun stores specifically because the mega banks, the bankers, they want the guns to be disarmed because they want to rule the world. The banks are very powerful Illuminati organizations. And now the small banks, the mom and pop banks, they're now going to try to keep them from servicing the gun stores. Disgusting. All right, next article. Jesse Jackson enters Sterling Frey, orders sale of team. Political correctness reigns supreme as hypocrite rallies on basketball court. I haven't really followed this whole thing in regards to the basketball scandal with Sterling, but this is probably a case where he did hate speech, which can be hurtful. And remember, not all speech is absolute. You don't have the right to harm people, and there can be words that can be used to harm people. So freedom of speech. Speech is not considered free speech if it hurts others. All right, I've said that a zillion times already. Moving on. Man arrested for criticizing Islam. Chilling. Political leader charged with hate crime for quoting Winston Churchill. Quoting Winston Churchill and criticizing Islam. Don't know exactly the Churchill quote there, but yeah, you can criticize other people as long as you don't try to defame them. What's this about speech I'm talking about so much? Well, why is that? Wonder why. But anyway, seems like a trend for some reason tonight. But anyway, there are things about Islam, just like all religions, that can be criticized. Islam, very notorious for shutting down the divine feminine consciousness energy with the way women are designed to be covered up when they go out in public. And Christianity is notorious for being intolerant. They say Christianity is the only true religion. Christians say they seem to tolerate other religions, but the Bible does make it clear that the only Savior is Jesus. I mean, you have the right to freedom of religion. It's necessary for a free society, but taking up a religion is not a good idea because the Illuminati created religion centuries ago to suppress human consciousness. The fact that religions teach benevolent things is an illusion. That's the way reality is. I don't think the Founding Fathers knew that when they put freedom of religion in, but they probably still would have put freedom of religion in the First Amendment, even if they knew, because they want people to choose their beliefs. Bless the Founding Fathers. All right, next article. Supreme Court refuses challenge to NDAA indefinite detention of Americans. Throws out case against provision that could see Americans kidnapped by government without charge. Well, there are three Rothschild Zionists on the Supreme Court, Kagan, Ginsburg, and Breyer. And some person told me that Sotomayor is also a Rothschild Zionist. I haven't done really the research on that, so I'm not going to say that's for a fact. But Ginsburg, Breyer, and Kagan are Rothschild Zionists. Rothschild, most powerful Illuminati family. Zionism, a global government-seeking, totalitarian, dictatorship-minded group that masquerades as a Jewish movement. They don't want that the NDAA, indefinite detention of Americans, willing to go down. The Supreme Court is corrupt. I just explained why. And now the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is apparently corrupt, and I wonder how this case, when it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, what it's going to be like. It's obvious. I don't know. Maybe I should show up at the Supreme Court that and find a way to say Eddie Craig's video shows this is illegal, or I don't know. But anyway, moving on. Two more articles. Shock video. Actually, that's a video. Never mind. Dashcam footage shows Nevada deputy extorting $50,000 from innocent motorist. Driver told to give up cash or have car towed after illegal search. Or maybe Nevada's going to get on this whole thing that Pennsylvania just did. All right, one final article. Russia orders urgent dispatch of military medical teams to Ukraine border. Another sign that Moscow is preparing for war. Well, I hope it doesn't become war, but the whole situation in Ukraine, just keep the U.S. out of it, will ya? Just keep the U.S. out of it. The Founding Fathers didn't want us to go to war in other countries unless we were attacked. All right, but Andrew Basiago still isn't on the board. Unless this is him. I don't think it is. I think it's my regular caller. I'll check the mail after I do this. But area code 386. You're not Andrew Basiago, are you? 386. No, you're not. So, all right, folks. I can't believe I have to do this so much. I have to check my Gmail account to see if he sent me anything. He said he would be gone. I did tell him I'm going to spend the first 5 to 10 minutes of the show before covering news. So, I don't see any mail from him. Hope nothing happened to him. Let's go to his website and see if I can find anything. ProjectPegasus.net. he did confirm with me that he could be on my show. So I don't know what's going on. I hate it when this happens. I hate it when I have to read the Alex Jones news and then all of a sudden I find when I look at the board that my caller hasn't called in yet. I did tell him 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. I told him April 30th. So I guess the least I could do is send him a message, although I don't think he's going to be able to see it right away. Bear with me here, folks. We're going to see what's going on. Still hasn't called in. I remember Andrew Basiago was actually supposed to come on an episode of In 5D Radio once, and he had to cancel because of some illness. But he contacted them and told them nothing happened. Told them that he couldn't come on. He was not doing very well. Folks, I'm going to put myself on mute for a couple minutes. Just hang on for a sec. Folks, I'm actually going to try to call Andrew Basiago's office number, which is on his page. My God. Did the powers that be do something to him because they didn't want him to come on my show? He hasn't been harassed before. So, see what's going to happen. All right, folks, I'm going to put myself on mute as I give him a call, see what happens. Folks, I'm actually talking to Andrew Basiago on my cell phone right now, which is actually right next to my headset mouth speaker, as a matter of fact. He can hear everything I'm saying right now, but he will be calling in any second, and the show will go on. Relax. We're getting there, folks. Just bear with me here. Yes, you do. The call-in number is 646-478-4747. No, 646-478-4747. All right, I'm going to hang up on you on my phone, and all right, bye. All right, folks, you can call in any second. Must have had so many things on his mind, he lost track of the show, but I'm not even going to bother. I don't want to hear anybody criticize him for this. Everybody makes mistakes. So, they'll be calling in any second. Let me turn on my phone just in case he calls me to see if there's a problem. Okay, it looks like he's on now. So, hey, Andrew, area code 360, is that you?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, how you doing? Hey, I don't even want to ask how you forgot about the timing of the show and everything. That's not important. 5 minutes behind schedule, so we might as well get started. So before we get into the really important stuff about time travel and Mars, you are running for president in 2016. I think we might as well start with that. Tell us how you plan to go about that.
Well, I'm a registered Democrat running as an independent. I'm going to seek ballot access in the 50 states. There may be some where the ballot access requirements are too high or they require party affiliation to register for. But I believe that it is viable, the notion is viable that an independent can seek and win the U.S. presidency in 2016, not only in fulfillment of Governor Jesse Ventura's prediction of that fact, but the demographic numbers support it. Because, for example, right now, only 50% of Americans who are eligible to vote are voting. And of the 50% of the potential electorate that are, 50% of those identify themselves as independents. That means that the two major parties that I would aver basically have a stranglehold on the presidency in an unconstitutional manner, because Article 2 did not establish the political parties that are now in control of the presidency, only have a embedded support consisting of 25% of the electorate. In other words, both the Democrats and Republicans only can count on 25% of the electorate, the potential voters, as supporting either of them, which means that although the Democrats have a slight advantage now electorally because of the demographic shift share to Hispanic voters, both major parties only control 25% of the electorate. They only have the loyalty of 25% of the electorate. And that means that we may very well be at an historic break point in the history of the presidency, that an independent could win and then possibly move the country toward a model of direct democracy such as exists in Switzerland, which would liberate us from this untoward, essentially usurpation of the presidency by the two major parties. And that's what I'm going to try to do. I may not succeed the first time out, but that's what needs to be done, because we're not getting the critical leadership that we need to even survive as a country, that the average voter, that the average family needs to survive as an individual or as a family. There's been no action, for example. What is it now? It's 7 years into a depression, and we've had no fundamental change in tax policy that would recapitalize the American people. They have completely forgotten about us. They serve only their corporate and special interest masters. And I believe that Governor Ventura is right. I think that the people reject that, and that if given suitable candidates, they will shift independent and elect myself or Governor Ventura or an independent like us to the presidency.
Yeah, and I'm actually planning on running for the U.S. House of Representatives for Pennsylvania as a third-party candidate in this upcoming election. I frankly don't expect to win. Like I said in the introduction, it would take a miracle for me to win, but I'm just going to do it to get the information out to the public and hope I have a good time. Not even going to ask for any money, not going to even spend any money. It's totally grassroots, but I'm sure I'll have a fun experience with that. But one thing I want to talk to you about is you said you don't really know if you'll win the first time. Well, we all know Ron Paul should be our president right now. The only reason he lost the Republican primary was because he got victimized by massive voter fraud. He would have won, and he would have kicked Obama's ass had he been on the presidential ballot. And he was victimized by massive voter fraud. Do you ever think that the same thing is going to happen to you?
It will, if I get the support that I think I can garner by the time of the election. So both publicly and on my campaign website, I'm going to ask those who ultimately vote for me to send me a postcard providing their name, their date of birth, their social security number, where they voted for me, and their signature. And then I will deliver those postcards and will contest the election if, in fact, the statistical analysis of those postcards shows that I actually won the numerical vote and or whether we could derive whether, in fact, I won the electoral vote. I believe that Secretary of State Kerry was under an obligation to do that in 2004, as was Vice President Gore in 2000. I think that when we see this kind of voter fraud and the person who is actually elected by the people is prevented from taking the oath of office, that is literally the subversion of the U.S. Constitution, which over 1 million Americans have died in foreign wars to protect our right to live under a constitutional republic and do things like exercise our right to select our president, vice president, and other officials. So the way I read it is that regardless of what social or civil distress it might foment, anybody who would state that they're running for president or vice president and that they're suitable to serve in that capacity has to protect the Constitution and the rights of the American people by not acquiescing in voter fraud and insisting on that recounts occur, that the judicial process be used to establish who received how many votes and in what states, and to uphold the integrity of our electoral system. So if that happens in my case, after we have a leading accounting firm basically count and analyze those postcards, I would then not fall on my sword and concede a race that I won. But then again, that's highly speculative because it's going to be difficult to win the first time out because I'm a newcomer. But I do believe that ultimately I will be elected president. In fact, part of my story, having served in the U.S. Time-Space Program Project Pegasus, involves having received information from several individuals connected to the CIA that ultimately I will be elected President of the United States. What I was not told is what election I would win, and hence what election year I will win. But I do know that I'm destined to be president, and unlike the last 5 or 6 presidents who also received prior knowledge of their presidency resulting from the quantum access capabilities of the CIA, I'm the only one of them to have come forward when running saying, look, time travel has essentially undermined the constitutional protocols by which we elect our president, because the CIA has been briefing the last 5 or 6 presidents, going back at least to President Carter, years in advance of their presidencies, years in advance of their elections, to tell them that they are in fact destined to be president. Similar information was shared with me, but the difference is I'm doing right by the American people, and in the very process of running, I'm risking my election by sharing this highly controversial and maybe even unbelievable information. But that is, in fact, the case.
Okay, there's a couple of things that I don't know if you can call it strategy, but your whole thing about running for president gives me a couple of ideas here. You said the whole thing about the Constitution. Well, anybody who's ever read Lysander Spooner's book, No Treason, knows that the Constitution is technically an illegal document because the Founding Fathers, despite their good intentions, passed it without the consent of the common people. And the tyrants in the U.S. government and the New World Order realize this. They know they're not stupid. They know this, so they try to maintain the illusion that the Constitution exists, while ironically and paradoxically at the same time trying to brainwash the American people into wanting to get rid of it. And that's why it's so easy for them to take an oath to defend it while simultaneously violate it without consequence. That's the first thing. I'm making you think maybe we should expose the fact that the Constitution doesn't exist to show that the government is playing us for a sap. That's the first strategy, Andrew. But the second thing is, you're a lawyer, and in my interview with Rule of Law radio show host Eddie Craig, who I mentioned in the introduction, you should all watch his masterpiece video, Secrets Police Don't Want You to Know, on the Alex Jones channel. If you follow the advice in that video, you won't pay traffic tickets. But he has explained in other presentations that because of state bar association laws and laws involving conflict of interest and whatnot, lawyers cannot serve on non-judicial positions, and I'm assuming this will be true with the federal government. So this gives me an idea. If you were to become president, would you want to say, I'm a fraud, I should be impeached because I'm a lawyer, I'm not eligible? Because that would prove that a lot of other politicians are ineligible, because there are a lot of lawyers who are actually serving political positions, and that, according to Eddie Craig, is something that's not legal. So do you think maybe exposing the Constitution is an illegal document and showing that lawyers can't be on non-judicial government positions is a nice strategy that you might want to consider?
Well, actually, no. I would view that as too arcane a position, and I don't believe it's factually supportable. I do agree with the opinion, for example, I would cite Jerry Frez's book on the Constitution, where he establishes that to a certain extent, the Constitution, as distinguished from the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution itself, and the statements that were made by the leaders of the Revolution, was essentially subjected to a counter-revolution by moneyed interests, by the plutocracy, what was then the harbinger of the corporate moneyed elite in our country, and in that sense embodied a counter-revolution. But I think George Reed's requirement of a Bill of Rights, of a positively stated Bill of Rights, leaves us with a positive legacy in the Constitution, that even while the Constitution tends to favor the financial oligarchy, nonetheless, the Bill of Rights was a tremendous advance in civilization, and that I think where we are actually at in the historical moment is to elect a popular leadership that will protect the Bill of Rights not only from encroachment, but from wholesale derogation by the permanent secret government that is now upon us. For example, look what's happened to the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, just carried out by the last several presidents. I mean, we've gone from possessing the exclusionary rule, fruit of the poisonous tree, on unreasonable or unwarranted searches, to a situation now where the exclusionary rule doesn't even exist, and people aren't just being searched without warrant, they're being violently assaulted by the police without even probable cause, much less a warrant establishing from a magistrate establishing probable cause to arrest or detain. So I appreciate the exploration of these issues intellectually, but right now, in terms of what's most beneficial for the people, I think we need to protect and defend the positive legacy of the Constitution that was left us by the Bill of Rights against further further corrosion and deprivation. In regarding the matter that's made about lawyers, there are many ideas that are out on the internet about certain aspects of what an attorney is. An attorney is essentially just, or an esquire, is somebody who is learned in the law and who has passed a state qualifying bar exam, usually under their state Supreme Court, to represent somebody before a tribunal or commission, a court, tribunal, or commission, to legally advise them, and to attorn, which means to sign their legal documents. I reject some of the spurious notions, for example, that bar means British Accreditation Regency. That was poppycock made up by somebody on the internet, and when I originally challenged him, I believe his name was David Gould, he could not verify his claim. It was made up. The use of the phrase bar is not an acronym. It's a reference to the physical bar, the piece of wood in the court that ordinary citizens can't step before to advocate somebody's legal interests as if they were that person. So it's simply a functional title that came from the practice of attorneying for other people before courts and tribunals and commissions. In a similar way, I don't believe the argument that this individual has made. For example, we have never required elected public officials who are attorneys to recuse themselves or to temporarily stop out from being members of the bar in the way that there's a widespread practice for judges to do so. The judges do so because they have to pledge their impartiality, but neither a practicing attorney nor an elected representative is obligated to do so. So there is no conflict of interest. What is a conflict of interest is the specific conflict of interest that arises when an elected official, lawyer or otherwise, acts in a way as a public official to benefit his clients. So what might be appropriate, certainly would be appropriate for the presidency, in fact this has been practiced, is to put the maintenance, the management of a president's clientele, if he's a lawyer, or just his assets in general, if he's just a private citizen, in a trust account or a set of trust accounts under a decision maker, so that the president doesn't know the decisions that he might make that might profit either himself financially or his law clients in the event he's an attorney. But I basically reject the notion that such an obligation exists either legally or ethically. I don't believe it exists. What exists is an ethical duty as a public servant not to profiteer based on what you know or on your decisions that you make as an elected official.
Okay. One thing I want to discuss here, Alfred Weber, your colleague, I had him on my show before. That was a fascinating interview. It went viral, and for good reason. We discussed very important stuff, especially Fukushima in that interview in the first hour. But he talked about how the year 2017 is going to be a time of great consciousness shift, and he talks about how star children and indigo children are being abducted, not abducted in the bad sense, but benevolent aliens are tampering with them to prepare humanity for the consciousness shift that's supposed to happen around 2017 when you're supposed to be president. And Alfred Weber, among other things, said we kind of need a consciousness shift because Fukushima is a global extinction disaster. The only reason we're not undergoing extinction at a fast rate is because higher dimensional ETs on alien councils and such are keeping the radiation in check. You can only imagine how bad it would be if they weren't doing that. So we're going to have a consciousness shift in 2017 or so, we've been told. I guess it depends on the timeline, when it exactly will happen, because timelines are not based on when, they're based on what. But the point is, if you were to become president, you would have to deal with a massive consciousness shift on a global scale. Have you looked into this at all and thought about this scenario?
Well, let me just say in prescript, I was told by two individuals with lifelong professional associations with the CIA that I would one day be president. The first was my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, who was a special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, who was one of the principals on DARPA's Project Pegasus, basically the real Philadelphia experiment, the actual time-space program when it emerged in the late 60s and early 1970s. My father was he was privy to secret information, especially that which was being gathered by the CIA's growing quantum access capability from Project Pegasus, because he was the point man between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of teleportation, of Tesla teleportation. The second set of briefings I received 20 years later, that was in 1980, by the way. My dad affirmed the fact that I was going to be president one day, not to encourage me. I mean, he was a truth teller. He was an honest person and a great dad, and he wouldn't have put a silly notion in my mind just to make me strive to become president. He was basically telling me what he had learned through government channels. The second individual was a career CIA officer, as distinguished from my dad's work on behalf of basically the defense technical community rather than the CIA per se. This career intelligence officer was Courtney Maurice Hunt, who was a training officer and a jumper on the CIA's Mars jump room program that began around 1976. Courtney trained me for Mars and the jump room program in the summer of 1981 after I did a summer under Major Ed Dames with a group of other American young people in the summer of '80 up near Mount Shasta. We were at College of the Siskiyous, getting basically a kind of a seminar on Mars. Both my father and Courtney Hunt, as individuals who knew each other, but my father was deceased by 1990. Courtney spoke with me in the year 2000, 20 years later, that the first time I asked him whether I was going to become president, he said, yes, but I don't know how you get there. A couple months later, he said, no, but you're going to be on the scene, indicating that I run and don't win, or that let's say I become vice president, and that's how my services manifest. And then the third time he said, have you been briefed? When I asked him, do I reach the White House? And at that point, I really wasn't thinking about my past experiences. I just had a sense it would come true, maybe the way that Barbra Streisand always kind of knew she was going to be a prominent, singer and entertainer. So I was just asking Courtney, and the third time he said, have you been briefed on 2015? Now, if I win in 2016, I will take office on January 20th of 2017 as an indigo child. I mean, I was doing some fairly remarkable things as a child. I was reading my dad's thoughts. I was able to take an object and hold it out and then let it go and cause it to hover rather than fall to the ground. So these special abilities were known to the government, and they were one of the reasons I was brought in to Project Pegasus originally as a 6-year-old when I first teleported from the old Curtis Wright facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, to the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds in New Mexico. So when Alfred makes that prediction, my second point I want to make about that is I don't prognosticate, because most of what I learned about the future while serving in Project Pegasus and later was either shop talk that I overheard or direct briefings to me that were made by people like my dad or Courtney Hunt as a fellow Mars jumper, albeit a senior one, and somebody with a career at CIA. But what I'm saying here is I only know what I was told. I'm not basing my quote-unquote prediction of becoming president one day on my own innate beliefs, either as a psychic or as a former indigo kid or just as somebody seeking the presidency. What in fact I'm doing is I'm saying, look, this is all I'm saying. I'm saying that the U.S. government has achieved quantum access to future and past events, and that generally they didn't want to set the course of future events because doing so would diminish the quality of the intelligence database about future events that they've been compiling since around 1970, with secret but established government knowledge of events like the advent of the internet or the attacks of 9/11, things that would really affect the country in a profound way. So all I'm saying is that that's what the government has been doing. I have direct personal knowledge that President Carter, both Presidents Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama were among the future presidents briefed of their destinies as president. But all I'm saying is this is what I was told. So, for example, when I predict what I would do as president, like on Facebook, my followers and indeed my supporters in Andy 2016, I say if I'm elected in 2016, because it would be more than arrogant to say when I'm elected in 2016. So I want to be real clear about what I'm saying. I'm saying I was told I would be president, but I'm not saying I necessarily have to become president. What if in the course of my life and some of the special project activities I was involved in, my original timeline where they determined I was destined to be president has shifted, and I will run in 2016 and again in 2020 and so forth, and maybe be one of the more colorful political personalities of my generation, but not reach the presidency. I mean, that's possible. So I want to be clear on that. Now, Alfred, using basically collating different sources, not just me as one of his friends and colleagues, but other people, think that that shift towards more of an indigo polity will occur in 2017. I think that's ambitious. I think that the year is going to be around 2020. But I'll tell you this, and I'll even make this quasi-prediction on your show, which is when I discussed 2015 with Courtney Hunt, after he said, have you been briefed on 2015? I said, no, what does it involve? He said, well, there's going to be a room for some pretty unconventional candidates for president and vice president, because there's a mass discrediting of the government that results from a huge payola scandal in which something like 300 members of Congress are found out to be de facto CIA agents with Swiss bank accounts. So I'm sharing that again, not because I am prognosticating that that's going to happen, but simply because a career CIA official who was involved in both Project Pegasus, the time space program, and then the Mars project, namely the Mars jump room program, briefed me on that event happening. If it doesn't, maybe Hunt was deceiving me. But if you imagine, let's say, a 60-minute story where Steve Kroft does like a focus group with 5 or 6 idealistic young members of Congress who revealed to them that they were approached by the CIA to be the CIA's proxies in the Congress. And they did a little digging in the Congress and found out that the Congress had largely been co-opted by the CIA for money, serving covertly to the possible detriment of the people's interests, and clearly in some cases to the actual detriment of the people's interest. Clearly we would have an unprecedented situation in the United States where the constitutional crisis would be the legitimacy of the elected officials themselves. And I think under those kind of circumstances in 2016 or 2020, by then my apogee in the truth movement will have risen, and my life experience and so forth, and my public reputation, where it's conceivable that I could be elected president. But right now, I'm realistic about the fact that I'm a relative unknown. I haven't served in elective office, but I'm even getting emails from people where they say something like, you know, I didn't know who you were, and I dreamt that I was at your victory rally in Seattle in 2016, and then I looked you up on the internet and found your Facebook sites, your websites, and I realized you're actually a candidate for the president. At least you will be soon declaring for the presidency. So I'm having paranormal input that's reaching me from some people in which they have literally seen me being elected. That'd be maybe about 100 people have contacted me over the years saying, I do see you as a future president, literally eidetically. So something not ordinary is going on in my life and career. And again, I'm just dedicated to telling the truth of it so that other people can understand what's going on. But I think I could handle the presidency in 2017, but I can't verify Alfred Weber's specific timing because I wasn't given the timing of my presidency. I was just told by my dad and Courtney Hunt in separate discussions in which Courtney certainly didn't know necessarily that my father had briefed me 20 years earlier that I do reach the White House during my career.
Okay, want to talk about, speaking of presidents, want to talk about Obama for a moment. I've heard you say that despite people calling Obama a tyrant and whatnot, he was actually a pretty nice guy when you knew him in the government programs, and you said his real name is Barry Soetoro. He's used many aliases, but Barry Soetoro is the one that's the real name of him.
That's the name he was using. Right.
Yeah, yeah. A couple of things about Obama. Yeah, a couple of things about Obama. It's interesting to note, Andrew Bartzis, Akashic Records leader, said that the powers that be harvested Obama's soul from Saturn. I'm not really going to get into how Saturn is a soul, a repository of sorts, but they did say that. And it's interesting to note that Donnie Gilson, who Alfred Weber has done a series of interviews with, 32nd degree Freemason, who's done a lot of research on Planet X and whatnot. He said that he saw Obama's eyes during the Osama bin Laden fake raid speech on May 1st, 2011. He said he saw Obama's eyes shape-shift. Kind of makes you think maybe Obama has been captured by malevolent reptilians, and even David Icke has on a couple of occasions depicted Obama as being a reptilian in a couple of his pictures and whatnot. If that's the case, that would certainly explain how he's not the same benevolent guy that you knew when he was with you. But tell us about your experience with Obama. What are the things about that you want the general public to know about your experience with Obama and who Obama is?
Well, I mean, if the measure of what somebody is in college is any measure, I view Barry as a very positive individual, and bear in mind, I don't support a lot of his decisions. I certainly oppose his decision to maintain the war. I oppose his actions, and I certainly oppose his actions in putting the NDAA before the Congress, which I think was a sacrilege against our constitutional history and our culture, our free and democratic culture. And I also oppose his decision in giving the TARP money to the banks rather than the families in foreclosure. In fact, I've done a lot of foreclosure defense myself as a lawyer in solo private practice on behalf of families in foreclosure. But I am dedicated to the truth. I'm going to be running in 2016 and any later election that I have to run in. literally under a banner that it says in capital letters, truth. That is my life's purpose, is to tell the truth about what I've experienced and what I've learned. I first met Barry Soetoro, who had just done a year at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, when I was taken by my father from Southern California to the Mount Shasta region in mid-August of 1980, ostensibly to have a camping trip between father and son, as we had camped with my entire family going back to 1964 when I was a 3-year-old. And at this stage, all my older siblings had left the nest, so my dad explained it was just going to be he and I this time. My mom wanted to stay home in Southern California. But when we camped at the campground on the northern shore of Lake Siskiyou, literally within view of Mount Shasta, we met, and my father certainly teamed up as a Parsons engineer, with a man by the name of Thomas J. Stillings, who was then employed as an operations analyst for Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California. Of course, my dad has just put in 8 years at the Pasadena and Los Angeles headquarters of Parsons after Parsons moved to Southern Cal, and we with it in 1972. And a couple of strange things started to happen. One was that when night fell, my father announced to William Stillings and myself, the son of Thomas J. Stillings of Lockheed, that we weren't there for a father and son camping trip, respectively, but to take part in a class on everything to do with Mars. And then when I questioned my father about why Brett or I, but certainly myself as somebody who was destined to enter UCLA in the fall as originally an English major, I then became a history major at UCLA, would need to learn anything about Mars, especially after I completed my astronomy breadth requirement the previous term at UC San Diego. He looked at me and just phlegmatically stated, because some of you kids in the class are going to be going there. The next day at 1 o'clock, our father stood up at the campsite and began walking towards another campsite. So Brett and I kind of skipped ahead of our dads. I mean, Brett was 13, I was then 18. So we were certainly in the peak of health, and our dads were middle-aged. And so we reached the campground before them in the direction they were going, and literally almost bumped into somebody we knew quite well, a man by the name of Edwin Eugene Buzz Aldrin, Jr., the second human being to step foot on the moon, we were told, at least in this epoch of human civilization. And we were startled because then Buzz said, "Andy, Brett, pleased to meet you, Buzz Aldrin. Well, let me tell you, fellas, you're soon going to be doing something that I did a few years back, and that's go off planet. Well, let me tell you, guys, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime." Brett and I kind of looked at each other again like we had when my dad told us the night before that we were going to be going to Mars, kind of like, oh my God, it looks like our dads have implicated us in something pretty serious. Neither of us had intended to become astronauts during our lives, or chrononauts as I had been as a child. And yet that's what then unfolded. The next day they drove us up to the College of the Siskiyou's Extension Building in Wairika, California, and we met Major Ed Dames, our instructor, and the other 8 young people and one 30-something individual, Bernard Mendez, who were going to be our co-Mars jumpers. Among those we've identified as being some of the other young people who had been conscripted into this secret program was a young man named Barry Soetoro from Hawaii, who we now know as President Barack Obama, and a young woman named Regina Elvira Dugan, who President Obama appointed the first female director of DARPA on July 20th of 2009, on the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing, and a future space shuttle pilot, the late William Cameron McCool, who was piloting the space shuttle Columbia when it was destroyed on February 1st, 2003, re-entering Earth's atmosphere. We haven't been able to identify the other 5 teenagers, but Bernard Mendez, the older 20s, early 30-something, who was also monitoring this class, we not only were able to reach, but he has become a fellow whistleblower with Brett Stillings and I about the fact that the U.S. was sending young people to Mars via jump run in the late 70s, and we got taken up in the program in summer of '80. Now, contact with Barry just in that learning context that summer. I sat next to him in class. I would basically, talk shop with him during the beer parties, the keg parties we were having at night to kind of talk off our stress from what we were learning from Ed Dames. And at one point, we actually roomed together in the dorms at College of the Siskiyous. And the not Barack Obama, but the Barry Soetoro that I knew that summer and then later during several jumps under the team leadership of Bernard Mendez, the three of us going up, in other words, in the jump room to Mars together, I can say that at that age, Barack Obama was highly intelligent. He was relaxed, friendly, kind, considerate. He was particularly fond of defending the underdog, so that, for example, when somebody said something against a defined group, basically a suspect class, let's say, said something that was racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, or homophobic, the Barry Soetoro that I knew was so disturbed by prejudice that he would literally shun the person making an intolerant remark physically. He would literally turn his back to them, which I've never seen anybody else do, literally shun the person engaging in prejudice physically in the room, whether it was when we were talking outside class or when it was at one of these beer parties or whatever. So he was a person physically dedicated, personally dedicated to physically rebuking bigotry. And to this day, I'm still impressed by that. Sometimes his putative mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, was present. I got to know her. She gave an afternoon lecture on cross-cultural communications in which she cited having been married to a Kenyan and an Indonesian husband. And her lecture was as top shelf as any lecture I attended at UCLA for the 4 years that I was there as an undergrad. She was intelligent, funny, highly knowledgeable, and very insightful. In other words, they were very pleasant people to meet. There was nothing strange about him. Now, I don't necessarily believe that he's now possessed by some reptilian spirit, but I think that to some extent it's legitimate. That's almost a metaphor for the way I now view him, which is that he's somebody who, in my opinion, lost his soul after he acquired power. I really think that his principal goal is to be viewed as an acceptable president, as the first ostensibly African-American president, but I don't even believe he's an African-American. I believe he's an Indonesian, darkly complected as a result of his parentage by Indonesians, perhaps Javanese. In fact, there's a particular individual who was the founder of the Subud cult in Indonesia who may very well be the actual birth father of President Obama, and we know that British intelligence, MI6, has already reported to the British Parliament that their covert genetic testing of him based on glasses that he drank from during his first state visit as president to the United Kingdom, when compared to his mother's genetic material, indicated to a dispositive certainty that he is not the biological son of Stanley Ann Dunham. To kind of round this out, she was kind of his adoptive mother as a cover for him being handled by the CIA during his career. So I really think that President Obama is right of Bill Clinton, certainly right of Jimmy Carter, really not that far left of George W. Bush, and that he has consistently made the anti-democratic choice, the fascistic choice as president. And because I knew him in his youth and regarded him, certainly in retrospect, among probably the 2,000 same-aged peers I met during my 4 years at UCLA, I would certainly put him at the top of the list to be suitable for the presidency based upon what I could discern when we were college students. I'm profoundly disappointed in his performance. I think he has governed far on the right, just indicated by his decisions, almost as if he's being blackmailed by a right-wing faction. I mean, think of what, for example, what President Kennedy achieved in his 1,063 days in office, confronted by a Democratic Congress that was opposed to his most left-leaning positions. He still achieved so much. And yet, I think that because he was the first ostensibly African-American president, Barack Obama possessed the power to be kind of a little bit more aggressively leftist in his governing. But the profound, ugly surprise that's been foisted on all of us is that he's governed from the right. So I am disappointed in him, but did I see any evidence that he was not a normal person? He was not only a normal person, but he was especially so. He had a ready sense of humor. He was intelligent without being a show-off about what he knew. I remember I made a comment to all of the young people in the program during our going away dinner, which would have been around September 7th of 1980, at the Creamery restaurant that then existed down the street from the college. And we were discussing what the human impact on Mars would be. And I made an analogy to the negative impact on North America that the Europeans brought when they came to a continent that was 90% forested, and they've left basically a gardened wasteland, 10% forested. And one of the co-jumpers that was in training there said, well, we improved what was here. We don't just have trees here now and evergreen forests. We have schools and homes and hospitals and restaurants. And I said, yes, but we've denuded the whole continent. We even got into trouble by the time of the Great Depression on all the trees we had cut down. The Dust Bowl was fomented. And the only person, and somebody said another remark, and I said, well, ask the Native Americans if they think we improved North America, if they think we improved Turtle Island. And when I made that racially sensitive comment, literally referring to the Native American term for the lower 48, the Barry Soetoro that I knew looked over at me and nodded and shook his head yes and winked at me. So he was an authentic leftist in college. He has not been an authentic leftist as president entering office in 2009 when every other president of every other Western Hemisphere nation was a leftist. For some reason, he gave up on that authenticity of his basic worldview and character and has governed pretty far to the right for a Democrat, I would say.
Okay. Might as well switch gears and talk about time travel and timelines now, because that's probably the thing that most people know you for. I want to talk about, take a couple minutes to elaborate on my understanding of time travel and also what Alfred Weber discussed. The thing about, first of all, Andrew Bartzis, Akashic Records Reader, said that on planet Earth there are 3 timelines. There's the main organic one, and there's what he calls an upper and a lower. But when I spoke to George Kavaslis about this, he said, no, those upper and lower timelines, they're a grouping of timelines, and he said he doesn't understand why Bartzis would choose 3 as his number of timelines. But the thing about time travel into the future and into the past, time travel into the future is pretty straightforward. You can look into the future using the technology to see what will happen, and then the ability can do what they choose to do to suit that thing that they see in the future, so that will be their outcome. Such was the case with 9/11 when they, in 1971, they saw the newspaper clippings in the future, and that gave them 30 years to prepare for the attacks. It's a shame 9/11 truthers don't want to talk about this because they think it will destroy.
They won't. In fact, they've allowed me to be called a kook when, in fact, that is one of the most profound truths about 9/11 is that the U.S. government had images of it that my father and I saw at the Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, New Mexico in 1971, 30 years before the events of 9/11 happened.
Yeah, and I actually got kicked off of the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook page because I tried to talk about this. That's how serious they are. They care about their reputation that much. And I personally think you shouldn't give 2 rat's asses about what other people think about you, but some truthers seem to think otherwise. But anyway, the point is about time travel. Time travel into the past is a little more complicated because here's what George Kavaslis explained to me. There is no such thing as the grandfather paradox. If you go back in time and kill your grandfather before any of your parents were born, you will not vanish out of existence. You will just create another timeline, which is independent of the timeline you originally came from. Although I seem to recall a couple of instances where people tried to do that, and then shortly after killing their grandfather, they ended up being dead or suffered some horrible injury. I'm probably going to have to ask you to elaborate on if that would happen if you did that. But the thing, before I ask you to get into that, it's kind of confusing because that suggests that if the powers that be go back in time and do something to further their agenda, it won't affect us because they'll just create another timeline which will be independent of the one that they originally came from, which was ours. So that makes you wonder, why should we worry about the government traveling into the past? Well, Alfred Weber told me that you can think of timelines as lanes on a freeway, and you can think of a timeline interaction as a car merging into a lane that has a lot of cars, and that causes the cars in that lane, that timeline to change, the series of events to change. If that makes a good analogy, that's the way he looks at it. But in regards to the grandfather paradox thing, is there something about time travel into the past that I am failing to take into account, like, and also would kill your grandfather?
Let me set you straight on this and kind of modify Alfred's model, although it's pretty accurate. I think he derived it from my explanations to him. We live in a multiverse in which there are multiple adjacent timelines. I mean, right now, Cicero could be giving a speech right within a micron of your left ear, but not at articulation to your present timeline. On my right hand, right now, sitting in my car here in Oregon, to my immediate left, Shakespeare could be writing a sonnet, but I can't see him because he's on another timeline. Let me start with the Einstein-Heisenberg dilemma and then go into Schrodinger's cat, which some of what you said talks about, and then go into the grandfather paradox. Because if I start with the timelines themselves, you'll see what's going on. There was a dispute between Einstein and Heisenberg. Einstein believed that the universe exists because we perceive it, and Heisenberg insisted that the universe exists independent of us, but we're aware of it because we can see it. So it both exists outside of us, but then is perceived inside our brains. Heisenberg was right, and I can readily explain to you why we know he was right. Because if we were to, let's say, raise 2 children in New Zealand to know nothing about France, indeed Paris, indeed the Eiffel Tower, if we took those, let's say, 2 twin brothers raised in isolation to Paris and sat them before the Eiffel Tower, separated from each other so they couldn't communicate, compare notes as to what they were perceiving. If they were of ordinary mind, they would draw a picture on their pad of the Eiffel Tower. So the Eiffel Tower exists as a construct outside of their consciousness, but nonetheless, to be understood by them as existing has to be perceived and then cognized inside their mind as the Eiffel Tower that exists outside themselves. That's why when we lose our vision, we can only now imagine some things that are in our environment, but not in our cognition, in our minds. Okay, so the first principle that we need to grasp when thinking about time travel is that the other timelines, which you might also call event scenarios or dimensions, exist outside of our cognition, but can only be perceived by us when we use a time travel device to reach them. Just like now that I'm in Oregon, I can only perceive Washington State if I drive into it or take a plane and fly into it. It's outside my view right now, but I know it exists because I've already been there. It's in my memory. Okay. So when we were time traveling in Project Pegasus, let's say we teleported or we were immersed in a hologram generated by a chronovisor. Those time travel methodologies took us to other dimensions, which you could define again as event scenarios or timelines. They are literally quantum environments that pre-exist us. So for example, during my first chronovisor probe, which took place at the General Manufacturing Company facility in Convent Station, New Jersey, in the fall of 1970, I was taken to a Civil War battle. And when that 10-minute probe ended, I asked one of the docents from DARPA, one of the nice ladies that was watching out for us when we were doing things, I said, how could you have sent me to a Civil War battle when no Civil War battles were fought in New Jersey? I mean, we're still in New Jersey. This machine is in New Jersey. When the hologram collapsed, I found myself back here in Convent Station, New Jersey. She said, because we now think that in another dimension, that Civil War battle is now over us in our location in New Jersey in 1970. Okay, so the first principle, utilizing kind of an expansion of Alfred's model of a freeway, is that these dimensions or timelines or event scenarios, or even you could just call them time, space, places, you could call them quantum environments, whatever, they already exist before we then perceive them via time travel. Now, when we time travel to the past, for example, a past, let's just reduce it to the very past on this timeline. Okay, let's say we go and visit one of our parents and they give us information that absolutely proves that we're going to our actual past on this timeline. Because let's say they have a piece of jewelry that they gave to us in the present when we were a child or something. And we can say just positively, you sent me to the same timeline that's now informing this present time and place that we call the present. You do not change the timeline by visiting it any more than you change the present by walking into a department store or a restaurant or a church or a school or a hospital or your house. The entry of a person into a quantum environment does not ipso facto kind of change the channel and put that timeline on another footing. All it does is immerse that person in that timeline or that point in their original timeline that was not the point on their original timeline that they were on before they time traveled. It doesn't magically create a different present or a different day like is depicted in Groundhog Day starring Bill Murray. And if you think about it, why should it? If you're just an organic human being entering a quantum environment, what magical effect would cause Schrodinger's cat to happen, where the cat both jumps into the box or the pail, and another cat stands there, and another cat jumps to the side of the pail. It's a ridiculous idea that the leading quantum physicists have exploited. It's not valid. So I reject Schrodinger's cat. Now, in the case of going back in time to kill one of your ancestors, your mother, your grandfather, whatever, before your birth, if you are on the timeline that you're presently on when you go there, when you get there, namely you go to a past point on your original timeline, you can't succeed in killing your ancestor because you're alive to even contemplate the event of doing so. In mathematical terms, this is a function that is called, it's a fancy word, it's called being asymptotic to the event threshold. In other words, you can try to get as close as you can to the x-axis representing your goal, the killing of your ancestor, so that you will either change their time, the timeline they're in, or blink out, or suddenly die, or nothing happened on your original timeline. You'll create a second timeline in the past. But if you're on the timeline that you're from, you can't succeed doing all those trips to the past you make because you exist in the present, which is now the future from the perspective of the past that you're visiting to kill your ancestor, because you exist to contemplate and to attempt the attempt on that person's life. When you phrase the lemma mathematically, if you could go back in past and you killed your grandparent, that can't happen. So you're magically thinking at that point. You're framing an event that's a non-event, it's an impossible event, because you can't survive the killing of your grandparent by anybody, not even to include yourself, by a car burglar. Okay, so that's the answer to the grandfather's paradox. The paradox is that because you exist to contemplate killing your grandfather, let's say, on as many attempts that you would successfully try to do so, they would all default. For example, during one visit, you would try to shoot your grandfather and miss. During another visit, you would go to a place where you told your grandfather was at that time, that the chronovisor showed he was, but it was bad data and he wouldn't be there to shoot. In another event, you would try to stab your grandfather in the crowd scene, and somebody would see your knife and knock your arm out of the way. In other words, you can't kill your grandfather because you exist. So that's the solution to that. In fact, that answer to the grandfather's paradox is the true and necessary implication of my rejection of Schrodinger's cat. You don't create a second timeline by fiddling with the past. In fact, you go back and you fulfill the very past that existed before you time travel to go to the past to quote-unquote change it. You can't change the past because when you visit, you participate in the original event.
Okay, one thing about timelines that's really interesting pertaining to 9/11, Andrew Bartzis, he said that 9/11 at its most complex level was a massive timeline incursion because many malevolent and benevolent timelines were coming together in a war. One was trying to stop 9/11 from happening. The other one was trying to execute it. That resulted in 10 years of fear and the birth of a truth movement because the good timelines managed to make it obvious that 9/11 was so obviously a staged event. But there's a couple of things about 9/11 that I could be construed as evidence that 9/11 was a timeline incursion, and I'd like to elaborate on this for a minute before I ask you to get into it. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that Flight 93 was shot down, but there's also evidence to suggest that it landed in Cleveland, and while the planes can be shown that they were holograms, Andrew Bartzis did say that in some of the alternate timelines, they were actually real planes. And in the Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura episode on 9/11, they talked about black boxes being found in the World Trade Center. Were they black boxes of a UFO masquerading as a plane, or were they one of the black boxes from one of the real planes that was in an alternate timeline? Can you get into the subject of 9/11 being a timeline incursion and also the specifics I just covered?
Yeah. What I can offer is what I know. And I know that by 1971, we had footage of the event. I can also testify and provide direct evidence about what I've seen and what I experienced. In the case of the fact that my father, as being pretty high up in having access to the secret reports that were being prepared for the CIA by the staff members of Project Pegasus under DARPA, that my father was frequently asked when I was a child on the project, Ray, tell us about 9/11, this event called 9/11. Apparently it's some kind of domestic Pearl Harbor. Some buildings are knocked down in New York City. And when my father was asked, he would give the conventional sort of Time magazine year-end in review take on the facts of 9/11. I'm not offering that testimony to take that position, but just, again, to bear witness to what I experienced. I don't think anything that Project Pegasus did would allow us to have answered with a question of such subtlety and depth as to whether the event itself was the culmination of a set of negative or positive influences. I can say this, that kind of quasi-superstitious thinking about 9/11, granted, let me just give it a name. I think it's kind of superstitious or mythical, sort of, could be a natural social outcome of the fact that the hidden element about 9/11 is that the Bush administration had knowledge of it resulting from Project Pegasus, which not only had footage of the planes crashing into the towers, to the Twin Towers, but had literally briefed President Bush as a young man, and for that matter, Donald Rumsfeld, as a man not yet 40 years of age, that they would serve as U.S. President and U.S. Secretary of Defense, respectively, in the future. So the 9/11, the way in which the Bush administration dealt with 9/11 implicated the way in which they had been apprised as a result of quantum access about the offices, the high offices that they were destined for. So you have a situation where the very actors that morning at the cabinet level, the president, the vice president, in fact, we met Dick Cheney as a 29-year-old at a lunch at the La Hacienda restaurant in New Mexico around the time that the Bushes and Clinton and so forth were being apprised of their presence. You see, he was probably there in New Mexico because he was there to be apprised of his vice presidency or his career, also his career probably as chief of staff for President Ford. Okay, so the group of actors that day, political actors on the government side, were in possession not only of knowledge of 9/11, but prior knowledge of their own offices. So I think what probably happened is, and I also have to add that there was a finding towards 1972, right before I left Project Pegasus, where they were frequently discerning 3 alternate future timelines. The one most likely to happen, and then a next most likely possibility, and then the next most likely possibility. So I do remember the issue of three alternate timelines coming out. Sorry for I'm in a parking lot here. A car just is taking off next to me, so bear with me. But anyway, so I think the fact that quantum access to the event and to the roles that those individuals would play led to leaks of the information in a way in which non-informed individuals, outsiders, readily scripted more fanciful accounts of what was really going on that morning. What was going on that morning was the unfolding of a grievous set of events that somebody caused, whether it was an inside job, whether it was a group of rogue insiders operating independently, as I think may have occurred in the assassination of President Kennedy, or whether it was outsiders, indeed 19 Saudi operatives. The bottom line is that it was an extraordinary event because the very political actors who were acting that morning had prior knowledge of it. So, for example, when National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice informed former Mayor Willie Brown of San Francisco on September 10th not to fly the next day, September 11th, 2001, that advisement may not have been derived from current intelligence, namely some rumor that the country is going to be attacked the next day. Her advisement of Willie Brown may literally have been derived from information within the Bush administration that was as old as President George W. Bush's knowledge of his own presidency, which again went back to the 1970-71 timeframe. So that's how strange it was. Was it stranger than that? Was it some kind of quantum battle between heaven and hell? I don't know, but if somebody didn't put those pictures of demons and the flames that came shooting out of the Twin Towers, I could aver that it was. I mean, we could conclude that it was. So it's a very significant event. What I can offer the debate is what I have offered the truth movement, and basically the 9/11 truther community, and been widely disparaged for doing so, which is that a fundamental aspect of the event is that the very presidential administration that was in office when it occurred had prior knowledge of it going back 30 years. Indeed, the defense secretary who agitated for an attack upon Iraq when it looks like Saudi operatives attacked us, or Saudi proxies working for the administration itself, or even just others whose misdeeds were then, or putative misdeeds were then attributed to Saudi nationals. I can't say, but I can say that it was strange enough to have been a serious event in which not only did the administration have prior knowledge, but unless they were photoshopped in, some of the flames that were shooting out of those buildings had images of demons in them. So it was clearly an evil event, whoever perpetrated it. But in order to understand it historically, we have to know all the information that informed it. And I've done that. I believe I fulfilled my patriotic and my moral, my human ethical duty to do so, regardless of what a Kevin Barrett or any other 9/11 quote-unquote truther will say about me for telling the truth.
Yes, yes. One other thing about timelines. Actually, before I do that, David Icke, in his book, The Perception Deception, he did show pictures of those demons that you're talking about. He says there probably is some Archon connection there, but he didn't really elaborate on it too much. But one thing I want to talk about, the date December 21st, 2012, there's different things have been said about this. Andrew Bartz has said that was the day where everybody for a brief moment had a moment of universal dream time. Andromeda Council contacting Tolek said that's when the core of the Earth blossomed into 4D. And Jim Self, interestingly, said that the date December 21st, 2012, from that point onward, you are free in the sense that after that point, timelines are no longer relevant. Whatever you do will not change the final outcome. And it's interesting that some other government whistleblower said that there was a government program that said after the date 2012, it doesn't matter what you do, the timeline at the end will result in the same thing. And ET contactee Alex Collier has long said recently that timelines are no longer relevant. So can you offer your take on the significance behind December 21st, 2012 timeline-wise?
Yes, I can offer something original. It doesn't confirm the notions that you just stated. But, you know, some of the Montauk experiencers, Preston Nichols, Al Bielek, I believe Stuart Swerdlow, although I'm not certain, but some in the Montauk community, and by the way, I validate the historicity of Project Montauk for two reasons. One is that Project Pegasus was using the very chair that they described. It's basically a magnetic transducer that we were using it to bump our consciousness forward in time and pre-experience about a 20-minute episode in our own subjective futures. And from that trip, intelligence data would then be arrived about what we saw when we were in our future. I can also verify the existence of Project Montauk, which occurred, according to Nichols and Moon, after Project Pegasus, because Nichols and Moon identify Jack Pruitt as the quote-unquote research director of Project Montauk. Well, I worked with Jack Pruitt. Jack Pruitt trained me on the teleporter at Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, after one jump with my father prior to that. And Jack Pruitt was often waiting for us when we arrived in Santa Fe. And Jack Pruitt trained us in fall of '70 on the chronovisor in Morristown, New Jersey, after there was a threat to operational security at the chronovisor at Convent Station, New Jersey. So I can verify that Jack Pruitt, who they name as the research director of Montauk, not only is a real person, but that he served previously on Pegasus. And I last had contact with Jack in the now defunct Sweeney Auditorium in Santa Fe, New Mexico, during my June 2003 fact-finding trip to New Mexico. So Jack and his late son, Glenn Pruitt, were real people. I knew them during the Pegasus days back in the late 60s and early 70s, and then I met with Jack and his son in June of 2003. I can verify that the basic Montauk story is true, although it's obviously become a subcultural kind of phenomenon where people are adding some spoliated kind of issues. They're kind of vitiating the database about Montauk because everybody's been jumping in and kind of extending the story further and further. Okay, but regarding December 21st of 2012, David Wilcock and other people to discuss Montauk made the statement that that date was a date that we couldn't time travel past. That wasn't the case. In the actual project, beginning before Montauk even existed, when, for example, we were in what later would be called the Montauk chair, we just called it the chair. We could get past that date in 2012, but when we were going forward in time, we were told that you would sometimes feel a bump, like when you were in the Montauk chair and you had an OBE. And, for example, one time I visited myself practicing law in Washington State when I was 50. I'm now 52. And they said the bump you're feeling is we're going through 2012. Something happens in 2012 that's causing a bump, but we haven't figured out what it is. So I guess that question got elaborated as other aspects of time travel sort of got elaborated kind of on a post office basis with the constant retelling of the true facts, so that it became known as a time travel concept that our time travelers before 2012 were not able to get past it, indicating that the world might have possibly be destroyed in 2012? Well, we know it wasn't. But what was going on is we were hitting a bump in 2012. We weren't told what was causing that bump, but it was literally a physical bump that we would experience while going past 2012. And we know that we did go past 2012 not only as a human species on Earth, but even when we were time traveling back in the late 60s, early 70s, we got past 2012 because I was taking a large teleporter called a Stargate that was located on the basketball court of the Cerrillos Cultural Center compound in Cerrillos, New Mexico, to jump to 2045. So that was 1972. So even before Project Montauk, U.S. time travelers were jumping as far as forward in time as to 2045. So that wasn't a limit to our time travel, but it was a phenomenon of some kind that produced a physical bump when we were going past it.
Okay, one thing I want to talk about in regard to predictions and timelines, if I could elaborate for a couple of minutes on some prominent figures that have made predictions involving consciousness shift in the future, and they all turned out to be wrong. A couple of examples like Greg Braden, David Icke, and Ian Zell-Lungold all said that by 2012, the Earth, in conjunction with its consciousness shift, would start spinning in the opposite direction. That didn't happen. George Cavazos said that the Montauk chair experiments, 3 different people, they couldn't get past the date March 21st, 2013, so that made George think, okay, maybe we'll ascend into higher consciousness. Well, that didn't happen. Alex Collier said December 3rd, 2013 would be when we ascend into 5D. He was saying that back in 1995. That did not happen. Andromeda Council contact Tolik said that January 2014 we would ascend into 4D Earth. That didn't happen. So why are these people all wrong? Well, one simple answer is because we were never on that timeline. Well, why were we never on that timeline in all of those scenarios? Can you offer any theories on that?
Well, as a matter of first impression, I would say that these were outsiders whose worldview was informed by factors that were both sort of New Age beliefs and profound suspicions in a conspiracy-minded era. So, first of all, they're not insiders. And also, look, quantum access to past and future events sometimes includes the recovery of faulty data because the event scenario or timeline or dimension or whatever you want to call it that's perceived either by visiting it or by technically remotely viewing it with a device like a chronovisor, where you stand outside the hologram rather than being immersed in it and going there, simply takes you to a timeline that you either weren't on in the past as an individual or as a body politic, or that it goes on in some timeline in the future that we're not on. For example, in my first appearance with George Norrie on Coast to Coast AM in November of 2009, I described the finding where during that November 5th, 1971 advanced chronovisor probe from IPT Defense Communications in Nutley, New Jersey, I personally went and saw the U.S. Supreme Court building underwater in 2013. It could have been that March 21st, 2013 date that you cited. Well, the problem is that the chronovisor had already been known in the midsummer of 1971 to be taking us to alternate futures of the events they were sending us to. For example, they were sending me over and over again to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14th, 1865, which was the night that on our timeline, President Abraham Lincoln got shot in the head and was taken to the Peterson rooming house across the street where he died the next morning, April 15th. Well, every time they sent me there, the details of that basic scenario changed a little bit. It wasn't a boy taking the tickets at the front of the theater, it was a man. Or one time it was that boy and a man, and then the next time they were in different seats, and the man was taking my ticket and the boy was just sitting next to him. So in other words, it was the same basic event scenario with the major elements of the events being sort of the webbing of the quantum hologram. But the more variable information, like who that night decided to take ticket duty, which you might conceive of as being sort of a minor detail that's in sort of the interstitial gaps in the webbing between the twine of the quantum webbing, the quantum hologram, changed every time I was sent there. So some of these kind of predictions that have been given by the people that you know have resulted from classified information, but that doesn't mean that the intelligence community sources that have disclosed this information to them know to a personal certainty whether it was a past or future event that was visited or perceived remotely that is on our timeline. It may have just been a finding in the nature of my finding of the Supreme Court building being underwater in 2013. On our timeline, that grievous event, that terrible catastrophe, could have been just Hurricane Sandy, which was catastrophic enough to the people in New York and New Jersey who were hurt by that event, who were rendered homeless and destitute by that event. But nonetheless, the entire Atlantic seaboard did not, the Atlantic shelf didn't break off and render the entire East Coast under 100 feet of water. Thank God it didn't. But I'm just saying that just because something has been seen in a quantum access exercise doesn't mean that it happened on our timeline in the past or will happen on our timeline in the future. It's just a finding. The leading timeline, or 17 out of 20 timelines, show Barack Hussein Obama being sworn in as President of the United States the first time on January 20th of 2009. Then there's a reason for them to approach a young Barack Obama and tell him of what his destiny is, or even a young Barry Soetoro once they figured that out. Because on 17 out of 20 timelines, there's an overwhelming chance that he's going to be president, an 85% chance, something like that. That he's going to be president in 2009, and they just must have discounted the 15% in which Joe Biden became president, or Hillary Clinton. But we don't know also about those who are on the alternate timelines who also are apprised of the possibility that they might become president or vice president, because we don't know about the extent of the briefings that we've done. The only vice president that I've identified as having gotten a prior briefing about his vice presidency is Mr. Cheney. So presumably Joe Biden and other vice presidents have also been apprised of the offices that they were destined to hold. If not the president, then the vice president. Maybe even they were even given weighted averages. If you sample 20 future timelines, and on 17 out of 20 Barack Obama is elected in 2008, and in the other 15%, 15 out of 100 samplings, or 17 out of 20 samplings, Joseph Biden is, maybe they even went to Mr. Biden when he was a senator and said, look, Joe, get ready mentally, because there's a 15% chance that you're going to be elected president and an 85% chance that you're going to serve as vice president. It's certainly within the realm of possibility that they've even been giving weighted averages to the persons of interest who have been identified as future presidents and vice presidents.
Okay, I'd like to spend maybe about 10 minutes at most before we cover Mars. We actually have about 34 minutes left. But one thing I want to quickly cover before we go to Mars, you talked about in your presentation Jesus. Now, this is controversial because a lot of people say the story of Jesus, as well as other religious figures that are metaphors of him, are just an astrological metaphor for the sun going across the zodiac. Jesus didn't exist. However, those who follow the work of E.T. contactee Billy Meyer would know that there was a guy named Emmanuel who lived during the time of Jesus. Emmanuel's father was a man begotten by a Pleiadian Nordic extraterrestrial, and there are other sources that say that Jesus was Pleiadian, by the way, and Emmanuel's mother was an earth woman named Mary, and Billy Meyer says that the story of Jesus is a fictionalized version of the life of Emmanuel, and yeah, there is a correlation between Jesus and the sun, too, so both are correct in some sense, but you talked about that time travel into the past with which you were part and did see Jesus. Do you think maybe that was the Emmanuel that I just mentioned, or just for the sake of the Christians who want to believe, what can you give on this whole thing?
Right, I would say no, but let me also clarify. I did travel to the past physically, but on none of those, in none of that time travel where I physically traveled to the past, even in a hologram generated by a chronovisor, did I see Jesus in the flesh as a result of time traveling. I saw evidence of Jesus' life in an entirely different context. In the summer of 1972, which was the last summer that I served in Project Pegasus, I served several summers. Well, we were teleporting back and forth in the summer of 70. I spent a summer in 1971 living with my father in Albuquerque, and then we were teleported back to the afternoon of the day we had left in New Jersey, so that summer disappeared and was unprovable as having taken place. Then in the fall of 71, we jumped forward in time via teleporter and accessed the beginning and then the whole summer of 73, and then jumped back to fall of 71. And that was the incident where my mother received a call 3 weeks after we returned back to New Jersey that I had placed from New Mexico 3 weeks into our stay there in 1973, which was in itself a paranormal event because we dropped the house in November and the phone number in November of 72. So I don't know how we cut through from summer of 73 to fall of 71, so that I actually spoke with my mother on the telephone as she was looking down at me in the rec room from the kitchen. And then after spending that summer of 73, having accessed it from fall of 71, my father and I then spent in real time again the summer of 72 in New Mexico, and then jumped back to the beginning of that summer of 72. So just like summer of 71, that summer disappeared. Okay. During that last summer, the last one in real time, the one that right before I was just summarily kicked out of the project like all the other kids, we were just shoved off deck, right? Because that's what they do in these black projects. You just get to a certain point of involvement, and then they say, please leave. We're not going to be coming anymore. We're not going to be having any more project activities. If anybody asks us whether you're ever in the project, we're going to say the project didn't exist and we never worked with you. You're not going to be able to prove that you're in the project, so just live with it and be thankful that you had such an interesting set of experiences. Okay, so we had that in the beginning of summer of 72, but then myself and several other kids were kept on, ultimately leaving the project at the end of the summer of 72. During that summer in New Mexico, where my father and I then lived in the rental house in White Rock, New Mexico, that we had already summer sublet and lived in, by our reckoning in real time, in the summer of 1973, we're now living it in the summer of 72 after we had stayed it in the future in 1973. My dad invited his old friend Connie Chavez, a woman that at one point he was going to propose marriage to, and his number 5 child, myself, who he brought into this black project, for one of the periodic sort of treats that were given to people in the project. We were basically being given occasionally the privilege to do or to see something very special. And so he took us to a meeting of about 20 project people at a room at the Sandia National Labs in Sandia, New Mexico, outside of Albuquerque, that was about as big as a room that you might use in a high school to show a 16mm documentary to, let's say, 2 classes of high school students. Maybe a room that was about, I don't know, 40 by 80, or maybe 30 by 60. We sat there for 20 minutes and watched a black and white 16mm film of the hologram that a chronovisor had been propagated by my father and his team at Sandia that summer, showing several scenes in the life, the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and then his crucifixion. The scenes were occasionally blurry because they were filming a hologram, and so there were electro-optical effects that weren't suitable to filming in 16mm black and white. So sometimes they looked like there was rain pouring through the scene or scratch marks on the film, and at other times it was crystal clear. And there was no way that anybody in the room could believe otherwise than that it was not a Hollywood production, because a man was truly suffering to death in extremis after being crucified through the wrists and hanging there in a way that, let me tell you, it is a miserable death. It actually results from asphyxiation, from the lungs and the chest cavity collapsing from your own weight. And crucifixion victims will be in this extremis for hours. So it's a hideous way to bring about a person's death, especially somebody that as a Catholic Sunday school student I knew as God's Son, as the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. Okay. So there was a bias among some of the attendees. My father and I were not only Roman Catholics, but Mary Constance Chavez, born on April 28th of 1928 in Old Town Albuquerque, New Mexico, was such a devout Catholic that she spent her entire life, before dying from diabetes at age 53 in 1981, literally volunteering every day to do something to improve the lives of the nuns who resided at the San Felipe de Neri Church there in Old Town Albuquerque, New Mexico, the one that goes back to 1706. And so I'm saying, yes, there were some devout Roman Catholics watching, but in this DARPA-directed project, or these, nuclear engineers and their wives and girlfriends and children and so forth, who were invited to this privilege of seeing the crucifixion of Jesus, were not all Catholic, and indeed some of them were Jewish, and not all of them were Christians, among those who were Gentiles. And everybody in the room knew what they were looking at, from just a basic popular understanding of what happens in 3 of the 4 Gospels to Jesus upon his death. Many small details cohered, from the fact that it wasn't a cruciform object, it was like a tree that had been pruned with a small 2x4 across it, that the crown of thorns was about the size of a motorcycle helmet, that Jesus had dark hair and a dark brown beard or brown-looking beard and aquiline features. He sort of looked like a gaunt, aquiline-nosed British man with a kind of a Mediterranean coloration, even like an early Bruce Springsteen. I mentioned on Coast how he sort of had droopy eyes like Sylvester Stallone, so he looked kind of Spanish or even Italian. In other words, he didn't look Jewish. He certainly looked more like a Gentile of our own time, which is sort of ethnically curious. He certainly didn't look like the man in the Shroud of Turin, who had very bulky features, very older, sort of solid facial features, who I think, in fact, depicts Leonardo da Vinci depicting himself in the Shroud of Turin. But in any case, what we were witnessing was so horrific and so genuine that we all knew that it could not have been a hoax, basically a production of a great filmmaker of some kind. And it also cohered very closely to the New Testament depictions of Jesus' his execution and death. Now, I also can share the fact that when we left that viewing, Connie had been hiding her face from even looking at the crucifixion of somebody that she viewed as her Lord and Savior. And so when we got out of the viewing, my dad said, "Connie, I don't know why you're acting like that." I mean, I've described how I felt. I felt that evil was in the room and was swarming like a horn of wasps or hornets right in the middle of the room. In other words, I felt like I could barely look at the screen because the Prince of Peace was being murdered in a brutal way, in an unspeakably brutal and vicious way. So I was disturbed as a 10-and-a-half-year-old viewing this, almost an 11-year-old. But Connie was beside herself. She was hiding, unable to look at the screen. So my dad stopped outside the door, maybe 10, 20 feet beyond the door of the room, and said, "Connie, I don't know why you're acting like that." And she said, "What do you mean, Ray? They were crucifying my Lord." And he says, "Yes, they were, but we know what happens." And he said, and this is a direct quote, my father said, "My team also got footage of Jesus' resurrection. You have nothing to worry about." And Connie, being a believer in the sanctity of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, said, "You did get that, Ray? What did you see?" And he said, "We also saw what's depicted in Scripture. There's a flash in the crypt. Jesus stands up. 2 angels appear that look like human beings, and they help him push the stone away from the crypt, and he walks out of the crypt." Okay, now, I'm not sharing this data to proselytize other people and make them believe my belief that Jesus was who he said he was, namely the Son of a Creator God, and that he did actually resurrect upon his mortal death as a human being, which I also believe because I believe my father's veracity as a human being and as a devout Catholic. But that is namely my father as a devout Catholic making that claim. But I'm simply sharing what happened. And actually, from my position, the operative issue is not whether or not Jesus existed. It's not whether or not he was the Son of God, the Savior of the human race, the Savior of I or thou. The real historical issue, because ultimately we will die and our lives will pan out in whatever way that they're destined or that we choose to decide how they will pan out. But the current question in history is that since everything indicated that at that point the U.S. Defense Department secretly had actual footage of the ministry, the execution, and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, they made a decision to suppress those events as what I view as natural history events in the evolution of our species and our civilization, in the history of our civilization. So my take on this is, look, if we were to put religion aside and assume arguendo that it was the actual Jesus and his ministry, his crucifixion, his resurrection are in 16mm film canisters sitting in some storeroom in the Pentagon, like that last scene at the end of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, I have to say that's what we should be focusing on. We should demand that the government end this kind of secrecy. Because whether Jesus was God-made man or not, something paranormal apparently happened in his life where he resurrected. And what does the near-death literature now indicate? It indicates that we all resurrect after mortal death. The life between life literature that's been developed for the last 40 years by people like Raymond Moody and Matthew Morse up in Seattle, uh, by individuals like Daniel Brinkley and others shows that not only do we resurrect, but we apparently get a healthy copy of our body again, which the Bible talks about, in Ezekiel 38. So again, I'm not proselytizing. I'm simply saying that the state of the art in modern esoteric thinking and the noetic sciences is that what was exceptional about Jesus apparently was that he resurrected and came back to the earth bodily, whereas we are bodily re-endowed on the other side. And we actually are in an immortal body and then apparently are reincarnated in a physical body again and become a different person. So all I'm saying is if that's in fact what that film showed and we weren't being deceived by let's say a Dino De Laurentiis production of Jesus' crucifixion, and since I have no reason to doubt my father's reputation for truthfulness and his integrity as a human being and as my father and his faith as a Catholic, I believe the U.S. government is holding highly significant natural history data. And that's what we should be talking about, not whether or not Jesus existed, because even back in the day before my revelation was not shared with the public, we had people defending the historicity of Jesus by, for example, citing not the Emmanuel story of Billy Myers, but the Jesus story of the Hebrew historian Josephus. Now, I know non-believers will discredit that story, but again, they're not practicing what I try to practice in my Mars research and in my truth-telling about time travel and jumping to Mars and so forth, and events like this, which is we have to frame our beliefs based on our findings, not our findings based on our beliefs. And a lot of the people attacking the historicity of Jesus are simply concluding that he didn't exist and then accepting any data that supports that position and ignoring any data that doesn't. They're doing the same thing that some of the 9/11 truthers are by not only not believing me that the U.S. government had prior knowledge of 9/11, gained 30 years earlier via quantum access, but also that an event that was fundamental to the development of Western civilization and world history, namely the alleged specialness of Jesus of Nazareth, has also been blocked from being widely known by the U.S. government. And that's wrong. It's as wrong as if they were to hold back the knowledge that there was a President, Abraham Lincoln, who governed during a thing called the Civil War and was killed in April of 1865.
Yes, yes. Just so you know, we got about 19 minutes left, and I want to spend the rest of it talking about Mars. That you're very knowledgeable with time travel, but hey, we got to get into Mars too here.
Okay.
Before I ask you to elaborate on what you know about Mars, it's interesting that the Project Camelot episode on True TV, it got canceled the season after that one episode, which was about Mars, which you were in. Anybody can watch it on YouTube. They talked about how the surface of Mars is not the reddish color. We're told it's more like the desert of Arizona. The sky on Mars is actually a baby blue color, and you confirmed that even though it might be a little harder to breathe on Mars without a spacesuit, you would not pass out and die of suffocation. It is possible to live on there without a spacesuit. But what I'm interested in for the purposes of this interview is the U.S. government and the rest of the New World Order Illuminati forces. What are they doing on Mars? What's the agenda there? And if there are extraterrestrials, and there are, what are they doing? What's their agenda?
Well, when I was going up there in the early 80s, let me say that we encountered blue skies because while it's deficient in oxygen, the Martian atmosphere has oxygen, sufficient enough for people to breathe, but so deficient in oxygen that after several hours walking around on the surface at an ordinary walking pace, I would develop pains so severe in my thigh muscles, which are pretty well muscled, as a result of being an explorer, that the hypoxia causing those pains would almost cause me to scream in pain. I was almost crippled by those cramps resulting from hypoxia. But I did state before images were shown or found by the Mars anomalous community that the sky on Mars is indeed light blue because it has oxygen that's leaching from its rocks, from its lithosphere. And oxygen is a clear gas that refracts blue. That's why the sky on Earth is blue, not because of our 71% of the surface of our planet that's covered by ocean, by blue ocean, but because of the high oxygen content in our atmosphere. Our skies refract blue, and so it is on Mars. I stated that before those pictures were found by Paul Goodwin in the United Kingdom, Andrew R. Steck in the United States, myself, and others in the Mars anomaly research community. Okay, so that's one of the proofs that I was on Mars because I was making a claim that was heretical based on the 40-year accumulation of data since 1976. Where even the original Viking and Viking 2 pictures were colorized in a way that would make Mars seem reddish and made the the blue on the American flag on the Viking 2, for example, look purple, and the red on the flag on Viking 2 look orange, because they've been colorizing the pictures since then to block the blue skies. Because a blue sky planet is a planet with oxygen in its atmosphere, and a planet with an oxygen filled or with oxygen present in its atmosphere is a potentially habitable planet, and that's what they've been concealing. Now, when I was going up there with individuals like Courtney Hunt, Bernard Mendez, Barack Obama, or as he was then known, Barry Soetoro, and William Stillings, those were the two teams I was on. I was under Hunt and Mendez with Stillings and Obama, Soetoro, respectively. We were just going up there to basically to be seen and not eaten. We were part of teams that were just walking around to acclimate the Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. We were going via a jump room that was located at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California. We were going for the CIA because it was the CIA that had brought us up to College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. Ultimately, we started going to the main campus there in Weed in summer of '80 to be trained by Major Ed Ames. It's there where we were trained and later served with not just Barry and Brett, but Regina Dugan and Willie McCool. In some jumps, I went not with Laura Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President Eisenhower, but with her aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower. So just as my father and I and Brett's father and I were involved in the jump room program, Mary Jean Eisenhower was involved in the jump room program, and her niece, Laura, was invited to go there to Mars, to the colony there in 2006 and 2007. But I can only talk about what I know based on my experience and what others have told me. But I can only really know whether I'm right or not based on what I directly experienced. Okay, so what I directly experienced is we were going up there to begin the process of creating a defense regime, a defense establishment on Mars. A defense establishment that would protect the Earth from threats from space that could be interdicted from Mars. Now, why would this make sense? Mars is on an irregular orbit around the sun, and hence it moves in and out of its proximity to Earth on a 2-year cycle. So most of the time, if something hit Earth, a meteorite strike, some kind of solar system event that would either destroy civilization or literally extinguish life on Earth, a hostile ET invasion and takeover of Earth, having human beings from Earth on Mars was a propitious thing to prepare for, because it would allow us to save either the liberty of the human race on Mars or our human genome, our uniquely human genome. Now, Laura was not a jumper. She was invited to go in 2006 and 2007 through somebody that they put in her life as a romantic interest. But as the great-granddaughter of President Eisenhower, I believe that her testimony is extremely important, because seldom do descendants of U.S. presidents ever address issues of public interest, especially controversial ones like our allegation that we were taking a jump room to Mars in the early 80s. But later press accounts have borne out her to be true. All we knew is that we were going there so that the U.S. could claim territorial jurisdiction over Mars, because under public international law, one of the tests for territorial sovereignty is, have you established settlements and settlers on that distant land, and are members of your country periodically visiting that place and then returning to your jurisdiction? So I was in the group of visitors, thank God. Thank the Lord for small favors. I was just going up periodically. I went up about 40 times between when I first went by myself in July of '81 and my last jump in May of '84 with my father and a handful of some of the most principal people I knew during the program: Courtney Hunt, William Stillings, Thomas Stillings, Bernard Mendez, and others. Regina Dugan, I think, was on that jump. So we were going there because we were told that we were there to establish a defense posture, we were there to acclimate the locals, and we were there to create that pattern of visitation so that if the U.S. government had this assert at the level of public international diplomacy its right to claim Mars, then they could cite our periodic visits. Now, as an attorney and somebody in the truth movement, but certainly as a matter of first orientation and reality, I'm a practicing lawyer. Alfred is also a lawyer, non-practicing, but it's our position as colleagues and as Mars specialists, as exopoliticians, that this would have violated or will violate the space treaty. to claim territorial jurisdiction over Mars. Under international environmental law, it will also impose the externalities of our visits, our exploration, our settlements, and even indeed our colonization of Mars, with the untoward effects of those things by our Earth civilization. So because we believe that this planet does not belong to Earthlings, it belongs to Martians, and just as we would protect the planetary sovereignty of our own planet, because the space treaty exists as well as the settled opinion of humankind on Earth, that we have to bring this information out because we have to prevent the colonization of Mars by the United States of America or any other world government. And in a specific sense, Laura and I issued a public declaration on the existence of the jump room program and on the existence of the secret colonies there that she was invited to join, along with her two twin boys who were then 10 years of age, because Mars belongs to the Martians, and even in the selection of visitors, they weren't respecting the diversity of the human genome on Earth. For example, we had one black jumper out of 10 trainees, very Sartorial, namely Mr. Obama. But Laura knew from what was being discussed with her, and I could verify, that there was a very white American middle-class constituency to the visitors and the settlers. So presumably the colonists were also being selected on, for lack of a better word, a white supremacist basis. And that would jeopardize the human genome if Mars became the harbinger of our human genome, because it would lack the genetic diversity of the human race on Earth. So these are some of the ethical issues for why Alfred and Laura and I have spoken out. And I salute both of them, as well as Bernie and Brett, for speaking out, because here we have 5 Americans who have literally spoken truth to power and prevented potentially a genetic disaster involving the human race, which is that the human genome would be carried on Mars if Earth were destroyed, or if life on Earth were destroyed and ended, just based on the genetic diversity of Caucasian Americans. And look, I mean, 22% of our surnames are German, so that we would have a very sort of Middle European bias on that survival population if we don't act more intelligently and make that colony, or at least that outpost on Mars, if the Martians permit it, for example, for us to be there, representative of the diversity of the whole glorious human race on Earth.
Okay, and these Martians, you talked about how they are of a bald-headed. They sort of look like Dr. Evil of sorts. You said a lot of bald-headed figures in pop culture are symbolic of the Martians. Yeah, and
there's actually 5 types, but there's 3 like us.
Yes, interestingly, a couple of things to point out. Lissa Royal Holt, ET contactee, said that Palladian extraterrestrials have colonized Mars in the past, and also Bob Dean, NASA whistleblower, he subscribes to the notion that the Anunnaki of Zecharia Sitchin lore, they have also colonized on Mars. Can you confirm or debunk that? You got 7.5 minutes, by the way.
Okay. Thanks for letting me talk long, because that's my style, so I really appreciate it today, Andrew. These are complex issues, and I think we have to go long on them. But by the way, Bob Dean, during my talk my talks in Scottsdale and in Tempe, Arizona, in January 2013, spoke out, voicing his support for the truth of both my time travel account and my Mars account, and then at dinner informed me that he thinks I'm an Anunnaki myself. But I just want to say that publicly, Bob, the great Robert O. Dean, he did speak out publicly in support of my status as a truth teller. So I really will always cherish that from one of the great ufologists in history, and really a fine individual, Robert O. Dean. But let me say that there are 5 basic typologies that we interacted with, 3 that were humanoid or hominoid, as the anthropologist would say. The first type I named Homo Martis Terris, meaning earthling on Mars, or Earthman on Mars. They are the descendants of our Martian colonists from the time before the solar system catastrophe that took place about 11,500 years ago, that ended contact between Earth and its colonists on Mars. They are basically probably so close to us genetically that they could reproduce, they could procreate with us. They are bald and homely, however, because they have been breeding in isolation in a breeding colony that has never gone beyond 1 million individuals. In fact, it's less than that, because that breeding colony also includes the second typology, which I've named Homo Martus Marctus, meaning Mars man on Mars. Those are the more diminutive, spindly-bodied humanoids like us with long heads, pointy ears, long pointy fingers with sharp fingernails, sometimes with antennae coming out of the forehead. That led to the Martian meme in modern Earth civilization. You have to take account of the fact that the indigenous form of Martian that was there when we got there in antiquity, prehistory, during the first civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, we encountered the indigenous Martians who looked very much like Martians have been depicted for 70 years by Hollywood and television. Even Ray Walston, as my favorite Martian, had that basic antennae humanoid pointy-eared look. The third group look like the gray ETs. They're probably an offshoot of the gray ETs, and I've named them, therefore, Homo Martus Extraterrestrialis. The other two are sort of not that meaningful to put in the same class. There are Sasquatch-like primates on Mars that we've named Homo Martus Sasquatchus, and there's a group of Martians that are in the 1/4 to 1 inch range of height that burrow in the soil, and that some of them actually have been killed by our rovers. And I have to credit Dave Beamer for first publishing that data of the casualties of the very tiny Martians by our rover tires. And I've named them Homo Martus de minimis to express the fact that they're very much like, for example, the first type of Martian I mentioned. They have faces and looks that are almost cartoonish in some cases and that vary widely. They're almost like little Smurfs sometimes very much like modern humans. But they're so diminutive that you'd have the chance of seeing them when you're walking across the surface, like you'd be able to pick up, let's say, a small cricket with your eyes. In fact, I never saw one of them when I was on Mars. I may have even stepped on several and led unintendedly to their demise during the 40 or more trips that I took. So that's the fifth type, and that's one of the ones of greatest moral pitch and moment right now because we're there now, and our rovers apparently are killing them just incidentally to our use of the rovers to explore Mars. So those are the 5 indigenous types of Martian hominoids, or primates, let's say, that we have to be mindful of are at the top of the food chain on Mars if you are to discount the several predator species that periodically eat them. So that's another factor that we have to consider on Mars is, should we rescue humanoids out of a sense of human rights and the use cogent norms against genocide, or should we take more of a precautionary principle approach and not rescue them from predation because they are in an ecosystem where they're lower on the food chain than several species that look basically like modern dinosaurs, okay, and have jagged teeth and very efficient killing machines in their mouths. Okay, so that's what we encountered. Now, I don't think any of the Mars jumpers from the early 1980s believed we were going up there for the New World Order or for some illuminist plot to save only some human beings on Mars. We knew we were working for the U.S. government through the CIA. We were asked to volunteer. Peer pressure was used for us to accept our volunteership and to do it in a way that would not be paid. So I'm going to be seeking compensation for all the known jumpers, including William Stillings and Bernard Mendez and myself, and those of others who would want to join that lawsuit, including, for example, Laura's aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower. But the bottom line is we were talented Americans who were being trained and administered by the Central Intelligence Agency, and we all knew that we were going there for an epistemologically valid reason, which is that catastrophe had struck Earth only 11,500 years previously. Some of that space debris may be coming back to hit us again if we don't elaborate a broad enough space program to take care of that debris so it doesn't hit and devastate Earth and Mars again, or the Moon. And so we knew we were serving in a program involving high purpose and one that was undertaken for the benefit of humankind, not for its enslavement.
Okay, that sounds great. By the way, I can give you 2.5 minutes. Do you know anything about time travel at Area 51? Because Andrew Bartz has said time travel was used at Area 51.
Well, you know, it's been alleged that there's a teleport there and at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas, you can jump to the U.S. military facility at Pine Gap on the Gold Coast of Australia. I don't know whether that's true because I myself have never been at Area 51 in any capacity. But I can say this, and that is, since I could tell where teleportation was going and yet being kept secret in the early 70s, the notion that they would have placed our teleport network at military bases and be using it to move the American president and other cabinet officials and military officers and so forth around the world in a very time-urgent way indicates to me that the assertion that there is a teleport at places like Area 51, Carswell Air Force Base, Pine Gap in Australia, is certainly a commonsensical direction that the program probably took. So I don't readily discount that claim. I think it's probably true.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the show. This was a fascinating interview, covered a lot of stuff, and I guess I should tell you the same thing I tell all my guests. Even though I would certainly love to have you on again, one of my goals on this show is to try to get as many different people on the show as possible before giving any one specific guest double dips. So while I admire your work,